Hello again. I am Goda, the organizer of this curatorial discussion series. The curatorial landscape or landscape of curating of visual and contemporary art is undergoing some transformations. Whether they are significant or not, we shall see, or maybe our participants will answer. Or maybe those changes and transformations are only natural and constant change. So today we have a very nice and wonderful group of participants, of experts in their field. This is Julija Fomina, from left to right, Paul O'Neill, Milda Ivanauskienė, and Lolita Jablonskienė. Julija herself has a very broad range of experiences. She recently left her position as a curator at the Contemporary Art Center. Now she's teaching students at Vilnius Academy of Arts on art history and theory and curating and working with the doctoral students and so on. So I'm sure she also told me that she has Paul's book on her table almost all the time. And she's constantly using the book to teach her students. So that's promising, I would say. As for me, this event is the third event in the series. So I will also invite you to come next week on the 12th of December. Same place, same time. The curators will talk future prospects, which is very intriguing. And of course, this all would not be possible without the funding of the Lithuanian Council for Culture. So that's enough from me. I wish you an enjoyable evening, and please.
Thank you, Goda. It's indeed very nice to be in such a nice company today, and thank you all for coming. And as Goda announced briefly, this talk today will be dedicated to the curatorial turn, which is something that has been around for a while now. And as you all know, that curators these days, fortunately or unfortunately, are not longer confined to traditional exhibition-making methods, but are also actively involved in shaping broader cultural conversations. And in today's talk, we will discuss some aspects of this turn. I guess there are many aspects, but we'll probably focus on some of them, and address current view on curatorial practice in international and Lithuanian contexts, and in particular the relation of curatorial practices to art history and changes that have taken place in the field of curatorship, and some trends of contemporary curating that we find interesting and important. And I'm very delighted to present today's panelists, if you wish. So first, it's Paul O'Neill, who's an Irish curator, artist, writer, and educator. And Paul is, since 2017, the artistic director of Publix, which is a curatorial agency based in Helsinki. And I hope we hear more on that. And he was also the director of the graduate program at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College, New York, between 2013 and 2017. And as Goda mentioned, he's an author of this brilliant book on curating that we also will touch upon a bit today. It has been also translated to many languages, only meaning that it's a very valuable source of information and history of curating. And Paul has also co-curated over 70 exhibitions, and is also, some of your books are also on the way, so we'll talk about that too. The next guest today is Milda Ivanauskienė, head of Mo Museum in Vilnius, that was opened 5 years ago. And in 2020 won the prestigious Most Welcoming Museum in Europe award. Milda is originally trained as a lawyer and started volunteering at the Mo Museum, then known as Modern Art Center, in 2012. And prior to the opening of the museum, she led their organization's strategic planning, branding, and participated in the construction process and building the team. And I invited Milda here with us today, not only because Mo is a brilliant museum, but also because there has been a very interesting processes going on, curating-wise in Mo, when curators not from originally trained as art historians or art critics are making exhibitions there. So we'll talk about that too. And of course, Lolita Jablonskienė is an art historian, exhibition curator, and chief curator of the National Gallery of Art in Vilnius. She has published research at Criticism and other articles, compiled publications, curated, of course, art exhibitions in Lithuania and abroad, and co-curated permanent Lithuanian art exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in 2009 when it opened, and 2019. She's also my dear colleague at the Vilnius Academy of Art, where she's a lecturer, supervises graduation works and dissertations of all academic levels. So this is our company for tonight. And I would like to start this talk from a bit of a historical overview. And since you, Paul, have published an extensive study on the history of curating called The Culture of Curating and the Curating of Cultures, where you gave a very in-depth overview of the historical development and central issues of contemporary curating. And the first question then I would like to ask you. In this book, one of your claims is that the change in the understanding of curatorship was shaped by a curator-centered discourse that have advocated and authorized the new independent curatorial practice. And I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts on that. And do you think that the curator would not have such an important position in the field of art today if he or she would not have created and defended that position himself or herself back in the day? By participating, or articulating that position more extensively in exhibitions, talks, symposiums, and by other means. In other words, do you think there would be a curatorial tone if the curators would not be speaking intensively on their behalf about the ways they make exhibitions during the last decades of the 20th century? So, what was this turn about, and would it take place if the curators would not, theorize about their practice so much?
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm always surprised, even shocked, when you walk into a room and people are interested in listening and talking about curating. So welcome, all of you. And it's really nice that so many of you turned out on a miserable evening. But thanks also for the very generous introduction and for the invitation. And looking forward to having a chat together. Maybe I'll start with the term curatorial turn, and then I can move through what is probably three questions. The first thing is to say that the curatorial turn, the way I understand it and how I would define it in an essay from 2009, which is a shift in an understanding of contemporary art that moves away from the objects of art into the sites within which art is displayed and exhibited. So this is the first shift within the curatorial turn. So with an emphasis not on the artist, but an emphasis on everything that surrounds the art and its situatedness, its space, its relationship between things, and so forth. So this is the first thing. But then second part of the curatorial turn is a shift from practice to discourse within the field itself. So when curators, rather than practicing the activity of curating exhibitions, are shifting towards a more kind of discursive form of practice. That is to say that they speak, they talk, they initiate more conferences, more discussions, they publish their texts and so on. So, and primarily about the exhibition or what thinking goes beyond and alongside and in relation to the exhibitions themselves. So this is what, when I use use a curatorial turn, it's those two things, that you shift away from the objects of art into the spaces within which art is shown, and then secondly, a shift towards discourse rather than practice. And I think that what's maybe maybe paradoxical about this, what you named as this curator-centered discourse within the curatorial turn, is that in a way the curatorial turn happens at a moment after a considerable period in which the turn has been already happening, where criticism, art criticism, also shifts away from a critique of the art and a critique of artworks and a critique of the artistic position into acknowledging that art itself is the value of art itself is created by many of the protagonists involved in its production, in its display, in its organization, in its criticism, and so forth. So this was what I would call curatorial criticism, and curatorial criticism kind of, in a way, shifts a kind of like an emphasis away from the kind of like artist as demagogue, or the artist as kind of modern genius, or the artist as kind of sole autonomous being in the world. And the contradiction there, of course, is that within the shift away from this megalomaniac artists, which are all mostly primarily white and primarily male, certainly at the turn of the last century, we also kind of see a shift towards the individual curator. So in a sense, this critique of the centralized position for art and artists, away towards acknowledging the role played by many other actors and agencies within the production of art, also happens simultaneously within this paradoxical move towards prioritizing the singly authored exhibition, or prioritizing certain curators within the field of curatorial discussions. So I think it's this paradox which I think is both generative and also maybe reductive, in a sense that it is ultimately contributed, as you said, or defended by many of the leading contributors or participants within the discussion, certainly at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and continuing into the noughties. But I think that it's also worth mentioning that these turns are not like complete. They're not like, one kind of like realm, or one kind of like notion of art shifts into a completely other notion of art. There is a paradigmatic shift, but these paradigmatic shifts, I think, take kind of a longer period of time. Like, we have 4 people sitting at a table now. We all have very different understandings of what art is, and we also have very different understandings of how to curate with art. And I think that there's also these 4, if I was to be very like taxonomical about it, there's probably like 4 different ways, or main ways, in which we think about the figure or the role or the function of curators. And I think this is also part of a kind of like a change of language, and then also a change of how the language ultimately defines a different kind of development within the curatorial. So I would say that the first shift is or the first kind of practice is taking account of curatorship, which means like looking after objects, looking after a collection, taking care of work, taking care of like dead people, taking care of dead objects, like very ethnographic, very anthropological, very much about the historical and so on, but very much like disappearing the authorship around the activity of curatorship. And often this work is carried out by a curator working within a museum, or it could also be within another larger kind of institution, a private collection, for example. It could also be in a library, which has a collection, and so on. A church also has collections. Some churches do. And then I think the second thing is to think about is maybe occurs in the 60s, late 60s, is exhibition making. And this is a very different type of practice to the practice of curatorship. Although curatorship is part of exhibition making centers the exhibition and what it is doing with the works of art and who is responsible for bringing these works of art together. And this is the producer of the exhibition, the curator. And then I think the third way in which we now understand curating, which is as a verb, and curating as a verb, certainly in the English language, I'm not sure within the Lithuanian language or even in many other languages, but I'm aware in German and in French and in English, curating as a verb starts to emerge much more in the 1990s, and I think Oxford English Dictionary only accounts for it in the latter part of the 90s, early 2000s. It's become known as the active engagement with artists to produce something that an artist would not necessarily produce without the figure of the curator involved in that exchange. So something new and something emerges within that dialogue, something which is unforeseen, something which is yet to come, something which wouldn't have been there in the first place. And I think this is the activity of curating. And then I think the fourth activity, and I'll finish here in terms of my response, is thinking about what you mentioned about like a widening of the role of the curator to take on maybe kind of a political position or an ideological position, or to take account of the relationship between art and the world and so on, more kind of globally configures function for the curator. I think that happens simultaneously at a time where the curatorial, the term curatorial starts to account for many different activities of which one could be the making of exhibitions, which could also be curating, collaborating with an artist to make work, and which also could be curatorship. But the curatorial doesn't necessitate the exhibition as its final form or the final outcome. The curatorial is really like a process, and it's also what is perhaps unique to each and every curator in terms of how they think about the critical component, or how they think about generating discussion in relation to the exhibition or the collaboration with the artists and so on. So
I was sure we were speaking about one turn, but now I found out that this has been many turns, which is very exciting. But I would now ask Lolita to contribute a bit to this conversation from curating or observing history of curating and also curating exhibitions in Lithuania. Since the early 90s, and in your opinion, and also maybe reacting to what Paul has said about these shifts globally in the field of curating, in your opinion, what are the main stages of curatorship as a specific activity in Lithuania, like the stages of development? What are the main stages curatorship went through in Lithuania? Because in case of Lithuania, our first exhibition curators were art critics. And do you think that it had some impact on the further development of exhibition making here locally?
Thank you for your question. I think that Lithuania went exactly through the same 4 stages as Paul has just mentioned here, just that we speeded. Everything which Julija mentions about the first exhibitions curated by art critics, they happened at the very end of the 80s and at the turn of 80s and 90s. And then during the 90s, noughties, and up to today, for a longer or shorter period, there was a focus on 1 or 2 and 3, of these possible, identities of the curator and the activities of the curator. if we didn't know Paul's scheme, and he hasn't presented it here, so we would probably say that indeed at the turn of the 90s we had the tradition of exhibitions that were organized in the Soviet time and even before the Second World War questioned. And questioning came both from the side of art critics and also from the artists with whom art critics collaborated. Because before those first exhibitions curated by the critics, in Lithuania we had annual like biennial, triennial exhibitions of both local artists and regional artists, so let's say Baltic artists. But with this new turn, there came an exhibition which kind of united a certain number of artists and their artworks into one narrative. I would say a narrative. These were narrative exhibitions, not that much discursive, but rather a narration based on a certain selection of works. Then at the end of the 90s and turn of, well, let's say second half of the 90s, turn of 90s and, noughties, we had a period of what I would call discursive exhibitions, because these were the ones which questioned not the tradition of exhibition making, but generally what the exhibition was. What is an exhibition? What are the conditions of the production of art? What are the conditions of reception of art? Who is an artist, or what is an artist, if one can say so? So these were exhibitions curated by, well, people who are sometimes in theory called artist curators, right? So most of them contributed, quite, seriously and profoundly to curating contemporaneity, as you yourself wrote in your brilliant dissertation. The third element, which also corresponds to much of what Paul said, but probably is associated here with the emergence, which sounds very funny, because the emergence of modern and contemporary art museums in Lithuania coincides with the 21st century. So as in the 21st century, the National Art Gallery started, functioning, the Mo Museum, some private collectors started showing their collections. So probably this was the period when the question of what is a museum, what is a collection, how do you work with a collection and with the contemporary art and a contemporary art in the field of the museum became crucial in that sense, very generally speaking. Though I would myself say that it's rather more working with memory than with contemporaneity, as it was, a decade before. And of course, as all these three waves, evolved and, had various, representations, a curatorial work, which could probably, and is called, and you yourself probably, I think you also called it para-curatorial activities, where curators are involved in literary work, publishing, performing, and, whatever also, happened here. If we consider that here suddenly became global. Because you do not consider curating in Lithuania sort of only in a closed, environment here in Lithuania, in the closed bubble of Lithuania. So it just became global, and everything sort of came into that. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yes, of course. And in fact, it made me think of, that there's no single way through history. There's many ways and they're intersecting. And now I would like Milda to join our conversation because As I've said before, Milda is the head of Mo Museum, which is quite a recent museum, recently opened 5 years ago. And when it opened, it was the curatorial landscape and institutional landscape was already quite dense. We also had a significant history of curating speeded up, as Lolita just explained. And prior to the opening of Mo, there was a lot of interest on how this new institution would participate in the curatorial discourse also. And in one of the texts, which was published prior to the opening, there was a thought by one of the founders of the museum, Jablonskienė, that Mo would democratize the institution of curator by inviting people from other fields of knowledge to make exhibitions. And this strategy was employed already several times in the exhibitions, The Origin of Species, 90s DNA, curated by a historian, a theater critic, stage designer, and so on. And then there was Why Is It Hard to Love by Peter Greenaway and Saskia Bodek. And then the most recent example is the one that is still on view now at the Mo Museum, is Venus Poker, directed by theater director Oskaras Koršunovas and curated by other curators. And I find this position of, or articulation of this position of democratization very interesting, and I would like to ask you to comment on it, if you can. And why do you think this democratization was or is necessary? And how do you see yourself from within the museum, the results of that processes, and also from today's perspective?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me here. I was hesitant if I'm the right person in this panel of experts, not being a curator or art historian myself. But still, I will share the practice we are engaging in and some thoughts what comes out of it. First of all, it's only, yes, as you mentioned, only 5 years of institutional practice, and we experimented a lot. And the free exhibition you mentioned, that was, of course, ultimately brought a curatorial team with different knowledge and different expertise. We had very traditional, in a sense, exhibitions with Anda Rottenberg, Giedrė Jankevičiūtė, Raminta Jurėnaitė, where curators as a solo players were assisted by the museum team. We also had different types of exhibition where we our input was as a co-curators. The team of Mo Museum joined as a co-curators of the show, like Tomas Pabedinskas, Erika Grigoravičienė show, and other more. And regardless of what type of curatorial model we took, every time, and of course, every time some institutional parameters came into play. And we have this mandate from the founders to be as open and accessible as possible, to invite audiences to the museum, for the museum to become a place of and a platform for dialogue to happen, to reflect on different questions, and the kind of threshold to come to the museum, it seems that it used to be still quite high. And in this case, this always having and inviting independent curators or different fields of knowledge. And of course, in inviting different fields of knowledge and different practices requires art historian part to leave room and space for that different knowledge to came into play. So coming back to the institutional kind of position, so it is all in many cases it was very obvious that these different fields of knowledge and practices, and so they bring something that later on gives results in an exhibition that is that has so many different angles. And in a way, it reflects on this polyphony of voices. So maybe this is the term of democratization is about not only one voice, not only one field of knowledge, but more. And I can share kind of already some feedback we got from the audience, not from maybe cultural field. The survey shows that the most, not maybe Vilnius Poker yet, but two most memorable exhibitions of Mo Museum, two most impactful exhibitions that audience still remember is 90s DNA and Why Is It Hard to Love? So, of course, having this big team is a challenge, and it's always a tension between in-house curators and institutional requirements or limitations, or our promise to the audience, our mandate to serve the society we are functioning in with some independent curatorial visions and maybe ambitions to realize certain projects in certain ways. So this is also a dialogue, but what I've learned that if parties are open to the dialogue, if it becomes a dialogue, despite the tension, the results are the best in a way. So maybe this is a comment.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, there's always, there should, in ideal case, be the room for dialogue. But I'm switching back again a bit to history. Maybe it's too much, we'll see. But it's my also field of interest. And I would like to ask the next question to Lolita again. Okay, so we spoke about Mo Museum, quite a recent institution, but as you said also that National Gallery was also opened officially the doors in 2009, following also a long process of thinking, researching and debating on the mission of this institution. And in your opinion, what, and also based on the experience at the National Gallery, what roles do curators play in relation to art history? Indeed, the curator has really to be an expert in art history, or is it not so necessary?
Well, I personally think that curators do not necessarily have to be art historians. That's, I think, very clear. In the museum, which has a collection, you somehow deal with the history of art in an art museum. Though you can, change the discourse into dealing with an archive, so then you potentially need an archivist. Then you can change a discourse, into thinking about the gender relations in your collection, and then you potentially might need a gender studies, specialist. So if one takes it very specifically, as a contribution to the writing of art history, I think both art historians who curate collections and exhibitions at the art museum contribute to writing and rewriting, especially in East and Central Europe, of art histories, decolonizing them from, let's say, Soviet remains of some Soviet classification, structuring, and everything, but also potentially curators who we commission as independent, or as I heard quite recently, in the workshop, which was an international workshop, the term interdependent curators instead of independent. And these are, I believe, interdependent curators with whom we work, because they're not only dependent to the museum who commissions, but they are somehow interdependent to various contexts that they come from, their backgrounds, their particular interests, and so on and so forth. So museums do work with artists as well, and I personally think that the artist's gaze on the collection and on everything which is in the museum is also very important. So what interests me as somebody in charge here of the of the state collection, in the same workshop which I said I attended on Zoom last week, I felt such an allergy to the word national collection that I stopped using the term for a while. I have to recover. In our case, it just basically means that really it's the state which acquired, that collection, not like private collectors, as in the case of more. What I myself think about, the contribution of people with various knowledge, backgrounds. I value some sort of, not only, as Milda said, putting all these different knowledges together, but also a potential of exchanging the roles, right? When, an artist suddenly becomes a leading, a figure in constructing or deconstructing the discourse. The curator might become an educator, or just a mediator to the audience. Well, so that's something which, I'm interested in, but I think it all somehow contributes also to how we understand the writing of art history in the expanded sense.
Thank you for your observations, Paul. Then your turn to express your knowledge also on the interrelationship between art history and curatorship, and also maybe a bit broader, but I think, if we consider that both art historians and curators do research, right? There was also some thoughts in the curatorial discourse that curatorial research is something different, it differs in the methodology, but it also has other outcomes rather than, papers or books or exhibitions, if you wish. So how do you see that, relationship between art history in a broad sense and curatorship, and also this research as a potential to dig deeper in both fields?
So many mics. I suppose I'll start with the art historian versus the curator question. I think they have, in a way, very little to do with each other, and I think, in a way, curating or the emergence of critical curatorial practice, in a way, is a major critique of art history. And I think certainly in the 1980s, this happens at the same time that museums themselves are being decolonized, or at least they're being thought of as post-colonial constructs. Maybe the term decolonizing hasn't emerged yet, but the idea that a museum is not a kind of carrier or purveyor of truths, and the idea that the art historian or one art history is just one particular story of art, and it's not the story of art, is also kind of like happens very much in the 80s. And it's not so long ago that there was like one history of art, and that we all had to study, and I assume people still study the the same stuff, and it somehow involves, you know, Picasso, and it somehow involves Duchamp, and it somehow involves, you know, all those blokes, and I think that what curatorial practice maybe suggests is that, like, art is a living form, and art has a relationship with life, and art has a relationship with the social. Not to say that history doesn't, but you know, seeing art as something contemporaneous and relating to the world in which we live, and as being kind of just as significant as art's position within a historical paradigm, is really like why people curate. It's like one of the reasons why people curate, to come up with a kind of critical view of the world, and to think about how art could be positioned in relation to this critical view that they have of the world, or that we have of the world. And I think that, you know, other people choose history as a way of doing that, other people choose sociology, other people choose writing, other people choose activism, some people use protest, some people use money. You know, there's different ways in which people use cultural product as a way of engaging with a critical perspective of the world. And I think the problem with art history is that we assume that a certain knowledge is necessary in order to understand art. So we have to go through all the steps. We have to study, and I did brutally study this, and I did an art history PhD doctorate, and then shifted towards curating in the mid 2000s, or early 2000s actually, and this was also just kind of like godsmacking that you still had to go through jump through these hoops in the 2000s in order to call yourself an art historian, and certainly within the so-called Western perspective of art history. So I think that's, you know, I think art history has always been the problem, or at least it's like it's part of the problem that we have in relation to art. Of course, the art world is another problem that we could also kind of tackle differently. And I think that, you know, curating emerges as a kind of critique, if not a hard critique of art history. I also think that this happens, curating kind of emerges simultaneously when artists themselves are perhaps not looking back as much, and they're actually looking forwards, or looking at their present condition, and looking at new ways in which art could be configured in relation to their immediate social context. And I'm talking about like the 1960s and maybe late 50s through to the 1960s, the post-war period, post-Second World War period. And then I think the third question that you asked, which was about curatorial research. I think curatorial research, in a way, takes many different forms. I think it also depends whether the research is starts at the beginning or kind of at the end. So, you know, the research can be a process through which something emerges, whether it be an exhibition or a thought process or something is produced. So this is allowing kind of things, ideas, and objects to emerge in the process of doing something whilst deeply digging. And I think there's also another way in which curatorial research, where you start with the exhibition, and the exhibition is produced, and then you start thinking about, well, what is the exhibition doing, and how it's a research action, it's part of a longer process. So it also depends, like, where you start thinking about the question of research in relation to the curator. Does it begin after you finished technical kind of like work of making an exhibition, and then writing about the what has happened, or writing about the construct, or writing about the process in the aftermath of that? Or that might even lead to other ways of thinking, more serendipitous ways of thinking about the ideas and their relationship with objects and the world. So, and then I also think that some people think about curatorial research as not being about art at all, and not being about exhibitions at all. It can be a way of looking at the world, which I also think is quite interesting. I mean, maybe I don't want to get into this like it's when it becomes really populist and people start curating their Spotify lists and people start doing this kind of like curating. This is not curating. This is not even research. This is just like having fun with with the stuff that you're listening to in the world, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's definitely not curating. No matter how much you organize your Spotify, it still makes you think in particular ways because of its digital and so on and so forth. But let's not go into that. But so I think that's but I think there's other ways in which to think about curatorial research that doesn't necessitate art and doesn't necessitate the exhibition. It could be the way in which you think about bringing a group of people together, the questions that you have on your sheet of paper. In a way, this is obviously deeply part of the research that you're already doing, and this is just one little small momentary stopgap within this process. That doesn't necessitate like a bunch of artists. It doesn't necessitate an exhibition, although this could also be a form of exhibition if we wanted to stretch the understanding of what exhibitions are. And I think this is the kind of curatorial research that I'm very much interested in. And this can also lead to exhibitions. This can also be about institutional building. This can also be about thinking about curriculum development. That can also be thinking about like how you organize your classroom, how you structure it differently, how you move the furniture around, how you move like the way in which you're seated in the room is very uncuratorial, because it's very organized in a very particular way, and you're circling around the cameras. You would need to break with that in order to start thinking about the relationship between you and each other and us and the hierarchy that's already produced within this kind of space. So I think all of these things are, I mean, it's kind of like an endless kind of like story in a way, but I think that's I was just recently and I'll just finish here, but I was recently taking part in as a curatorial advisor researcher on an exhibition at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, which just opened last week, which looked at self-determination in the interwar period, and I know there were works that were historical works and contemporary works that were brought from Lithuania, from Latvia, from Estonia, from
Was
Finland.
there anything from Lithuania? Because I spotted that exhibition. Yeah. I think there wasn't anything.
There wasn't anything? Are you sure?
I thought the Latvia Museum certainly. Yeah. I was very curious on that.
I think there was definitely something from Lithuania, or at least they said there was, but I'm not sure what the lending institute was. And whether it was, I don't even know whether it was a Lithuanian lending institution. But what was interesting about that was that it was like a coming together of curatorial researchers and a coming together of art historians. So there were people that knew so much about like Irish independence, and I'm Irish, and knew so much about like, the 1918, 1919, 1921, all of these like really important years in terms of the independence of this country, of Latvia, of Ireland, of Turkey, of Egypt, and so on. But
Ukraine, I think.
Ukraine, yes, 1917, wasn't it? Or is it 18? 18, yes, yeah. And I think this was a really interesting coming together of two different disciplines that have kind of an interest in overlapping with one another. But I also ended up sitting at a table with a lot of art historians, and these are the people who I admire and I have a lot of affection for. And they're constantly, and these are Irish art historians, so I have a very particular relationship with Irish art history. I studied Irish art history when I was a little person, smaller person, and you had to go through again these particular steps, and those particular steps are still the same steps that anybody goes through in order to understand Irish art history. And if you pick up an Irish art history book, it will pretty much be the same. And I would say that many of the art historians that were at this dinner have written these books. So it had to come up like, what's the story? Like, why you keep on like? Sorry, my mouth's really dry. Why are you constantly rewriting the same story? But the end game is always the same. And they're like, well, we just don't we don't know how to do it differently. We really want to. There's like this desire to try and find like a new contemporary artist that would change the pattern of development of Irish contemporary art. There's also like there's so many ways in which that pattern or that linear development could be punctuated, could be changed, and so on. Particularly if you brought in things like race, particularly if you brought in things like gender, particularly if you brought things like sexuality, particularly if you brought things like migration. Where did all those Irish people go? Are they not Irish when they moved to New York or London? And Brian O'Doherty is like one of the most important Irish artist, but then is often not acknowledged as such within the history of Irish art, and so on. So I think that it was really interesting to have this kind of like, I don't know, it was like an open moment. It was like a moment where a bunch of art historians, all of whom have done very significant work in terms of Irish art history, are kind of like, we need help. And then we're also going like, well, all this stuff. We don't need to know all this stuff because you know all this stuff. Like, can we just like work with the stuff that you know and vice versa? And I think this is where like art history and curating like can work really well together. Like that you were saying about the Mo Museum and bringing together these different disciplines and these different kind of like expertise and knowledge systems and so on. But I also am very like, skeptical of the possibility that, everybody can curate and nobody can be an art historian. This is like the narrative that we struggle with. Like everybody can be an artist and everybody can be a curator, but to be an art historian or to be a banker or to be a sociologist or to be an anthropologist, you really have to suffer and go through all of these steps, and then I think it's also like, art historians know a lot of art historians, but do they, like when they curate a show, do they know any curators? Have they studied any curators? Have they studied the history of exhibitions? Do they think about all these models and modalities and paradigms and so on? And this is what has to be part of thinking as part of being a curator, as well as art history and art histories and all the politics and critique that goes along with that. But I'm very skeptical of the possibility that anybody can be a curator, and art historians don't necessarily make good curators. They make good art historians, and that's why they're called art historians. And they don't always make good art historians either. So, like, not all curators make good curators, and there's mostly bad curators, and there's a few good ones. And I'm not in that bunch. When I see people that are really good, you kind of feel very.
I just wanted to add something a little bit about what I would think are important differences to consider. I mean, in the 1990s, the art history that Lithuanian students or art historians had collapsed. It was over. The discourse has changed 100% from the Russian language discourse, and the history is written in the Soviet period, and I would say by some very important art historians, to the English language discourse mainly. So the second important thing is that for a very long period of time, I think from the beginning of the 90s, art history in Lithuania was only taught in the art academy. I myself am an alumni of the Art Academy, not of the university. So the art history, which was, taught and somehow, I don't know, performed together with the artists, which were, rising as the new generation of contemporary artists, was kind of a different one than in the Western academia. So when we say that we changed made the rehang of the collection display of the Soviet period, it means that there is no history of the Soviet period of Lithuanian art. It's not written. So what we do have here, it's a curated history of Lithuanian art. I wrote an article a few years ago about curating of Lithuanian design history, which doesn't exist even in, in the shape of one longer article. So in the process of curating, I would say 2 or 3 or 5 exhibitions, both here and in other venues and other museums, the history of Lithuanian design was curated. It's not written yet. It exists in the documentation of exhibitions, in the experiences of, viewers or whoever in those exhibitions, in catalogs, also in the reviews of the exhibitions. So that's so far what we have. So there is a slight difference in relation of to the art history as, let's say, understood in the Western academia and in various other sites. It's not only about Lithuania. I remember having discussions, for instance, with people coming from Indonesia, from Philippines, where to a certain extent things are similar, where really established art histories as such, are not a burden, to carry for a curator or for a museum. So I'm slightly exaggerating that, but I mean, an element of that certainly exists. So I think, as use the word of speeding, so I at least think that speeding always comes together with some, I don't know if that's the right English word, density of things. So at a certain period of time, everything, you have a very dense content of everything coming together. Things which, in other countries kind of developed in time, here they all fall on the table or into your bowl, or into your glass, and can poison you. Sorry.
Thank you, Lolita. And getting back also to this either burden or, an obstacle of existing art history. Milda, I also know that in the Mo Museum exhibition, there's also a significant number of artworks from the museum collection. And from your experience, do invited curators see it more as a challenge or as an opportunity or an obstacle that they have to include those works into the narrative curatorial that they create, and that they necessarily have to have a museum collection as a resource that they have to keep in mind? How do they deal with that?
We had different experiences, and in the case of Anna Rothenberg show, we did not have any of artworks from our collection in the main hall, but then in accompanying show it was some, but still not many. So the policy is not to insist on including artworks from the collection, but of course it's a huge resource. And definitely when we think about the exhibitions we want to make, we usually somehow connect that to the stuff we have in the storage room. So this also was the case about Vilnius poker, the period coincided the collection. So I believe that this is a resource, and also this is a resource we kind of articulate for ourselves in the institution to build the relationship with different art scenes. As we had this exhibition, The Meeting That Never Was, with Fomina Museum and Charles Escher curating, Gabriela Radzevičiūtė, previous art curator, now at National Gallery, Andras Kröger. So two collections met. And I believe that this is a nice pathway to follow for the future of our programming, to find new stories that haven't been told yet, and exactly to build these relationship with different scenes, and still knowing that our art field sometimes, especially in this context of decolonizing and so, remains in a blind spot in Documenta, for instance, and so this is a way to build the connection and to build the new stories, and so this is a resource. And also we give loans and we bring artworks from the National Museum to our exhibition. So I believe that this is kind of lively exchange that's taking place.
Thank you. I'm watching the time now, and let's move a bit to the future, or contemporaneity, if you wish. And the question, probably the last question, and then we'll open the floor to your questions, would be what maybe particular trends of curating these days do you see most interesting, and why? Let's start from Paul, if you can. You have your own mic, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I just want to also maybe just respond to your comment around the kind of beginning of, you know, Soviet art being curated, and that's happens simultaneously when there's a history that's being written. I think there's a lot of maybe similarities within the kind of Irish context, given the power of the Church, the Catholic Church, for example, and the inability of Irish citizens to have access to a lot of culture that was happening in other parts of the world. And I also think there certainly from the 60s onwards, there was a lot of like collaborations and a lot of projects and networks instigated between Ireland and Poland, specifically, and then between Ireland and Ukraine, and between Ireland and different parts of so-called former Eastern Europe. And I think this was also, I think, part of a kind of like solidarity with maybe the independence movement or the Republican movement in the Irish context, or the idea of like decolonizing within our context, the context of Britain being a colony of Britain, and so on. And I think it's also like it's actually kind of crazy to like I was, in a way more obsessed with Poland than I was with like America when I was like in my teens, and reading like, I don't know, like obsessed with Elazitsky but not Duchamp, and all of these things. And I was like, why did that happen? And it's because these were the books that were in the library in the art school, because we were looking away from at least the librarian was. We had a brilliant librarian looking away from America and looking towards the East for kind of solidarity, and also for ways of thinking about other patterns in which like histories kind of emerge. So I think it's interesting to think about these parallel histories, and also these parallel major and minor histories as well, in terms of thinking about, when I'm talking about the history of Irish art, I'm in a way whimsically talking about the major history of Irish art. Of course, there are many minor histories of Irish art, particularly if you take feminism as your main like prism, or you take queerness as your main prism, or you take sexuality as your main prism, and so on and so forth. So I think it's also very important, I think, to acknowledge within my own giving out about art historians that there are many different types of art history. But then in terms of thinking about trends of curating. I think or turns. Yeah. I mean, of course, I think it's amazing that what you're still doing in Mo Museum and this kind of interdependence that you also talked about, or what I would call codependence, the codependent curator, and I've also written about this, that the idea that the curator, the independent curator, is codependent on the institutions that support them in order to curate, and the institutions are dependent on the curators in order to be independent. So they can get to bring in, like, other kind of repositories of knowledge, other ways of thinking that's not necessarily within them. They have greater freedom if you work with Charles Esch and Anders Kreuger than if you maybe do it inside the institution. That's also that. But I think that this codependent curating is becoming maybe more rare. I think it's, like, in a way, like, disappearing a little bit. I can't really like, I don't have the statistics on this or anything, but it's definitely not so prevalent. It's not so common. It's not so visible within certainly within the contemporary art field as it say was in the 2000s and so on. And I think we also had the kind of, like, massive increase in new biennials in the 90s and 2000s, which again, these biennials are now, like, disappearing. So there's less and less new biennials. Of course, the big ones, well, just about surviving, including Documenta, but just about, yeah. And perhaps will never be the same as it once was. And I think the last Documenta was perhaps the kind of the great swan song. It was basically we have won, but we have also lost within the winning. And I think this is also what was so sad and poignant and really beautiful about that show. Anyway, but I think this is also, like, maybe a trend or a turn, like a way toward what I would measure this with is a kind of not an emergence, because emergence always has a kind of somehow residual traces of the past, and also is very, like, future looking at the same time, but it still kind of is built on something, whereas I think now you have these cuts, like these, like, massive cuts and these massive, like, breaks and these, like, violent, kind of, like, I don't know if there isn't a more violent word than cut, really, but, like, these violent, like, blockages happening, and the rise of fascism everywhere, the rise of the far right, which is an activity of violence, but it's also an ideology of violence. It's also an ideology of the physical. It's not an intellectual. Like the far right is not an intellectual ideology. It is a physical ideology. It is like a violent ideology. It is ultimately about getting rid of any notion of difference. It is ultimately do it like going back to stay exactly as the idea of the origins were for these, like, white supremacist people, and I think that this also feeds into curating. It's not like overt, but you will see, like, in mainly large solo exhibitions by very well established, very expensive, very market-driven artists, whether it be in the States. I was just in New York last week, very fortunate and privileged to be there. But I was there, and there was, like, Ed Ruscha, and there's, like, Judy Chicago, and there's Carly Schneemann, and there's, like, all of these people, and all brilliant people. And but it's like, do I need to see another solo show by these people? Judy Chicago was great, but do I need to see all these things? And this is like, this is part of this same trend. It's like it's like giving us more of what we've already had, but it's giving it bigger, and it's like it's still a cut. It's still like a violent break with the possibility that oh, what happened to Black Lives Matter? Oh, what happened to trans rights? What happened to, like, you know, all of these, like, things we've been talking about, like eco-suicide and all of these things that have been happening in the last, like, 5 to 10 years and, of course, longer. But there was very little evidence of this, like, in New York. I went to London also a few months ago. It's the same thing, big solo shows, Chris O'Feely, Steve McQueen, Mike Nelson, you know, it's like all again, well, men, but like all these, like, you know, so this is a trend. It's like a kind of brutal return to something that was kind of there, but now it's absolutely there. You know, it's absolutely this big bombastic shows, and it's not like group shows, it's not collective shows, it's not exploratory, it's not bringing in like experimentation and so on. So this is like maybe a dominance, yeah. And I think what might be residual, if I use the whole the kind of Raymond Williams kind of way of thinking about emergence, I would say residual. You have the biennials, which are still, there's like little bits of leftover of these interesting biennials, thinking about the globals, thinking about the global South, thinking about, you know, inclusivity, thinking about diversity, thinking about the canon and changing the canon and challenging the canon from without, like from the perspective of Africa or from the perspective of Middle East or from the perspective of Southeast Asia and so on. And I think that this residual is still very interesting. And you know, Sao Paulo, I didn't make it to the biennial there, but I heard that this is very apparent there, particularly when thinking about the history of indigeneity within Brazil and various paths of migration of the Portuguese-speaking world. And then I think that this is definitely a trend, and then I think that the market-driven, you know, aspects of curating is also very dominant now. Like curators that were independent or codependent and in the 90s are now, like, they're working for big conglomerates, they're working for big market-driven collectors, they're working for as consultors for like people in United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and so on. So we all know this now, but it's also like, it's kind of okay, but it's kind of like shitty, you know? It's like, it's not, why is it okay? Like, why is it okay? Why aren't you coming to see my exhibition in Saudi Arabia? What? Like, why are you curating a show in Saudi Arabia? You know, so it's like this, and this is like also again part of this like aggressive, violent, like I think kind of a new kind of fascism, which is kind of permeating the biennial or the global art exhibition. Then on the softer side, in terms of curating trends, I think it's fantastic to have like a younger generation of people thinking about curating differently. Not all of which I have access to, or not all of which I fully understand, or not all of which I need to understand. But I feel or sense it being different, and it's exciting, and it's also maybe not. It's not really looking to basically have the same like stepping blocks as we had or some of us have had, and it might be even a return to this like earlier moment where, you know, artists become curators or art critics become curators or activists become curators because somehow you can do something with the curatorial that you maybe feel like activism can't do or art making can't do. But then I think within this I do have like a kind of like a slight warning or a slight like flashcard or something that there is also this tendency or trend for curators. I don't think it's a generational thing, but it might be a generational thing. But who are very just picking from the same pool of artists, and picking from the same like magazines, and picking from the same commercial galleries, and so it's the same pool of artists that you see even in Sao Paulo and here and in Riga and Paris and London, and in these kind of global perspective kind of exhibitions. And I think this is super problematic, and it's also now the kind of dominant way in which curators work, and they have to work with these artists in order to be relevant. And I prefer to work with people that are like friends, or work with people who are maybe less supported by the structures of the art world. And then I also work with people who are very heavily supported by structures of the art world, but I'm not working with them because their gallery is going to pay me a lot of money or going to pay for the production of the works by the artists. And then there's lots of maybe other smaller trends which are interesting, like small institutions or self-organizing, and also perhaps more interesting autofictional writing within curating also happening.
Thank you. You made so many trends. I was expecting, you'll pick one or two, but some of the things that you said also resonate, I think, in here, but also it also sounds as a history, we've been there before, that, for instance, big solo shows of big names, that we've been through that. Do you, Lolita or Milda, have anything to add to these trends, or maybe have a comment on what Paul just said?
Well, I think Paul has consolidated the moment in a very right way. I saw recently a PowerPoint presentation by the deputy director of the National Art Museum in Kiev, and about what they do. And what they do now can be reduced, I think, maybe reducing too much, to 3 points. The first one, for a certain period of time, the administration and the curators lived in the storage. First, the museum became the shelter, and second, sort of the very primal instinct of the museum curator to protect the artworks came into play. Second thing, what they do, they open the museum as the space of communicating for, a variety of people. So it's the space for basically meeting, being together and talking together. Could be about art, but could be whatever. And the third thing is they give the word to the artists. So they produced also a series of documentaries about Ukrainian artists and war. So that's basically it. But it was interesting for me, this kind of getting back to the foundation of, the storage as a shelter, the building as a meeting place, and, giving a voice to the artist. And I respected it very much, I would say. So then, just to answer your question very quickly, I wanted to say that before the war started and came very close to Lithuania, exactly, very, very close to Lithuania, I thought that my personal interest at the moment is also in what you, Paul, mentioned, in some kind of translocal comparisons, as, let's say, Irish art history, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Argentinian, especially, let's say, South America, which had its communist past, let's say, and Spain, if we wish, with its, let's say, both fascist past and its, left views, but somehow it now seems to be not the moment, for that. So I think what interests the National Gallery here and potentially maybe others in the curatorial is probably what you call the eco-suicide, but I would say all sorts of thoughts and practices which advocate sustainability. So.
Just as an institutional practice, I believe that this inclusion of certain topics and sustainability as a field of reflection about the exhibition, how many walls do you build, how long do you keep the exhibition, but also all sorts of inclusivity, gender balance, people with disabilities, and how do you produce a lot of reading materials and in what forms and also that means bringing to a table, to a curatorial team, more people from educational department, from different departments. And this is what we heard being in Athenaeum, Chiasma or Moderna, so that we bring just new practice to bring in all educational department under the curators and then working again together. So it could be the other way around as well. So for us, we still keep that path of interdependency and co-working together.
Thank you so much. And I would like to end here with a very nice tradition of the National Art Gallery to ask everyone to recommend a book for the visitors of the gallery. So which book would you recommend? Very briefly, and then we'll open the floor to conversation. If we, I hope we're not closed inside, right? Because it's 8 o'clock. Okay, somebody has the key. So yeah, what book would you recommend? I'll start from myself. You probably know my recommendation by now. It's a book that I highly recommend for everyone interested in the practice of exhibition making and curatorship to consider reading. Maybe not all of it, maybe the parts that you like the most or that you feel are close to you in a historical way, so to speak. I think it's a must-read. I recommend it as a must-read to all of the students that I teach. And I also think it raises many important questions, but also gives a room for thought, for if you're interested in exhibition-making practices. Maybe we'll go around. Yeah, Paul, your way.
Well, I think I suggested a book by Susan Stewart on longing, which looks at the idea of the souvenir, looks at memory, the mnemonic object, and it was very important to me in terms of thinking about everything from imagining a world where the object has a kind of interrelationship with otherness, but then also thinking about landscape, thinking about spatiality, thinking about the exhibitions as ritualistic, thinking about how they're also entangled with religion and entangled with schooling and entangled with all of the various institutions that build us, as well as are built for us and with us and by us. But it's a really, really great book. It was actually out of print for many years, and it was really hard to get a hold of. But the publisher has now got it back in print, so you can find it pretty easily. It was really difficult to find a few years ago. And then I've been also reading a lot of biographies or autobiographies by female or self-defined female musicians. And the recent autobiography by Cosi Vanituti, I think is really fantastic, because I think it takes on one of the biggest topics within the curatorial field that's never really really discussed or never discussed fully or fully disclosed, and that's the question of class, and also how that is tied to questions of gender and also access and then also history. Cosi Vanituti was perhaps most well known for having a relationship with Genesis P-Orridge, who many of you will know as part of Throbbing Gristle, and Cosi Vanituti and Genesis P-Orridge were part of that very important band. But she was also and is a very important artist and also a very important curator of artists of exhibitions and so on. But yeah, this was a really great book. Yeah.
Thank you, Milda.
My book was deliberate choice. It was a book by Sebastian Sikorsky, Art. Also thinking about inclusion and not forget kids, and to speak about art to kids and to make exhibitions for kids. And we have an exhibition going on at Mo Museum for kids. So just to not to forget this audience and have them in.
And I recommended the book, which hasn't yet come out. But I liked the title. Second, I liked some of the previous books of the author. That's Claire Bishop's upcoming book, Disordered Attention. I like the word disorder because it somehow resonates with everything which is in disorder at the moment. So, and besides, it will have on the cover the Sun and Sea, the Lithuanian famous,
At least 3 reasons to wait for it.
So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we had a nice conversation here. I hope you enjoyed it too. And there's a floor to questions now, if you have any.
Thank you very much for your talk and shared insights. I would like to ask Paul, probably as one of the editors of another very well-known book, Curating and the Educational Turn. Yes. So could we say that educational turn could be as an outcome of the curatorial turn in that way of a curator expressing his own or her own insights on the world, and maybe through the educational act showing or expressing some kind of opinion or a critique on the discourses he or she would like to discuss about.
I think I suppose I think a little bit differently about the educational turn than when we brought out that book, because I think the book was very much looking at a moment of capturing. It was very evident at the time that there were just talks, programs, there were free school projects, there were alternative educational programs, there were like free educational programs, there were collectives working with education, there were exhibitions about education, and then there was all, so there was a lot happening simultaneously, and we also, with Mick Wilson, we also recognized that what was happening simultaneously was happening kind of differently. So it's different, like the Free School for Art and Theory in Budapest, established by Transit Network, was different than United Nation Plaza, say in Berlin, which was established by the eFlux Paternity. These were differently using education around as a kind of a corrective, or as another way of imagining the curatorial, another way of imagining the exhibition, and I think that moment is perhaps saturated, and what has emerged as a kind of end moment within this is a complete dissatisfaction and a collapse of the educational system globally. The financialization of education, which already was happening, but it's pretty much like it's pretty much the default now, the idea of having a free education all the way through and succeeding within the field of art is like impossible now. So I think that's, and also what is being taught is also changed, and what is being taught is very administrative and managerial and very algorithmic and very statistic oriented. So I think it's also this is also the battleground which many people working within education, are either inside the institutions of education or outside, setting up alternative models and schools and programs and so on, are still struggling with this as a kind of an activist agenda. And then I think that the educational turn was very much acknowledging the need for other ways of learning and teaching art, and learning and teaching with each other. So thinking about the collective, thinking about participation, thinking about social practice, thinking about all these things which are maybe activist art, which are not always completely included within the realms of contemporary art as a mainstay. And these were kind of put forward as front of stage. And then I think also the e-flux, for any of you who are not familiar with e-flux, it's kind of probably the most globally networked online discursive program, also magazine, journal, curatorial platform, screening, cinema, exhibition space, all of these things. And for good or for bad, I'm not always a huge fan of e-flux, but I also recognize that what it has done is enormous in terms of like cutting out the main structures of the art world, and then putting in a new kind of economic structure, which is ultimately funded by galleries and museums who pay for the advertisements, and then they create kind of spaces of criticality. But I think the problem with e-flux is that it's just a very small group of people that are constantly contributing to it, so it hasn't really stretched its wings maybe enough, or for me in any way, but I still think it's an important journal. So you have things like that which have become more like mainstream culture within the art worlds. But yeah, the battleground for education is still happening within the curatorial field. And I think then it maybe just the final, they think that to say that in terms of the educational turn, that's the emergence of curatorial programs in the 90s, and 87 was the first one, but in the early 90s, we could say, was the emergence of curatorial master programs. Really, when you were teaching on those programs, you would meet like a whole bunch of different people from different pathways, from different classes, different disciplines, different genders, or, coming from all over, and all just like not knowing what to do. They knowing that they want to engage with art, maybe they want to be an historian, maybe they want to be a curator, maybe they want to be an artist. But this was the experience, and now I think the experience teaching on a program is that people just want a job, and they want to be handed a network, they want to be supported to get a job, and there's nothing wrong with all of these things, but that's different. It's very different and a very different pressure when you're teaching within these programs to facilitate a kind of a career path for somebody when there's a shrinking accessibility towards.
Thanks for very interesting points. I wanted to get back to the point you made about this kind of a limbo within Documenta, the exhibition of the exhibitions. Like, what does this signify for the current climate of, is this an ability of like being in the conflict
or is it a sign of some other aspects that would continue into the future? Because we're all looking into it as, I don't know, as a primary source of pushing the boundaries what an exhibition can and should be. So within that realm, what are your, I don't know, expectations?
Because you mentioned it, so.
I suppose what I was maybe suggesting is like Documenta as an institution that enables a large-scale exhibition every 5 years to account for the world as it is, and for the exhibition to be a space of political resonance and as a space of interdependency across the global art worlds, and also a space of curatorial autonomy or semi-autonomy. I think that's done. That's over. And I think it's not like all of the blaming can be continue to be placed on the curatorial collective around Grupa and their co-conspirators, if you like, which of course that will continue, and it's disgraceful that that's the case, because I think what they did was to acknowledge there's another way. There are many other ways of thinking about how we organize ourselves and how we exhibit and what we exhibit as our kind of forms of cultural production, and the ways in which we do that, and how we work collectively, and how we organize knowledge, and how we organize together, and how we reorientate the questions of the aesthetic in relation to the political, and how the questions of the political and questions of beauty, which are also kind of completely like historically specific, but also it can be beautiful. Politics can be beautiful, as well as hard and ideologically subversive and difficult and critical and so on. And I think also the possibility that an exhibition like that can somehow show us what's happening somewhere in the world as a kind of like node within a kind of a network of fields of culture production. I think they really looked at it from their position of knowing their context and also how that's situated in relation to other epicenters of cultural production. And I think there's also things like generosity, hospitality, hosting and guesting, looking after, taking care of, cure, not care, all of these things, which I think were really important. And yeah, I think that's never going to happen again.
Well, isn't it the case that the board of Documenta, which had to select another curator, has resigned? So we are in a much deeper crisis with the project.
Thank you all for coming, and come back next week, same time, right? Tuesday. Okay, Tuesday. 6:30, right. Okay, thank you all for coming and for being here with us. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts with all of us here. Thank you.
Thank you.